G'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to try and answer those common questions we all have. High megapixels versus low megapixels, full frame versus APS-C, cropping versus extenders. Can we upscale a low megapixel image? I think at the end of the day, we want to know, how do we get the bird big in the frame while maintaining as much detail as possible? Do we need expensive gear like this R5 and 100 to 500, or can we just simply use a really old APS-C body and a 400 5.6 prime? That's what we're going to test today, and that's what we're going to find out. I hope you enjoy. I think it's important that we have a look at focal length first. It's important we understand how focal length works, understand how it impacts the depth of field, how it impacts the size of the bird in the frame, and how it impacts the quality of the images that we're going to get. All right, I decided to do one test. I went from 100 millimeters all the way to 1600 millimeters. Just keep an eye on the background and how big the subject is. We'll start at 100 millimeters and we'll work our way to 1600. So we start at 100 and it's very wide. We go to 200. This is a big jump, remember, because we're actually doubling the focal length. The next one is 300, another decent jump, then 400, and then 500. And now to get to 700 millimeters, I actually used my 500 prime with a 1.4 converter. And then I added a 2x converter, which gave me 1000 millimeters focal length. Now that's the maximum focal length I have. However, the R5 does have a crop mode, which gives us a 1.6 crop. That takes us to an effective focal length of 1600 millimeters. And you can see just how big this galah is now at 1600 millimeters. When we compare it to 100 to 1600, the difference is vast. So what focal length do we need? Well, it really depends on the subject that you're photographing, how close you can get, and your style. It'll vary from person to person. So I asked my beautiful subscribers what focal length they currently use. So as we can see, about 60% or more of people use 600 millimeters or more. So it shows that that 600 to 800 millimeters is about the average, and that's what I use. I use 700 millimeters with my prime. If I want a light lens and I'm just walking around, then I'll go for this 100 to 500. So what do we do if we don't have enough focal length? Well, there's two ways to increase the size of the subject in your frame. That's by either cropping or using extenders. So let's have a look at those. Let's first take a look at cropping. Basically, you're just deleting the pixels around the subject, and by doing that, it effectively makes the subject bigger. Let's have a look at an example that I shot out in the field. So I photographed this duck at 300 millimeters focal length and 500 millimeters focal length. We can see that the 300 millimeters is a lot wider and the 500 is a lot narrower. So now I can crop the 300 millimeter photo to the same field of view as the 500. So we're now looking at an effective focal length of 500 millimeters. Can you tell a difference between the two? At this crop, they're pretty similar, but there's one obvious difference, and that's the depth of field. So the depth of field on the 500 millimeter image is just much narrower, which causes that background to go out of focus. Our depth of field does not change when we crop it on the 300. We've still got a much wider depth of field, which makes that background not quite as nice. And that's always going to be the issue when you crop images. So because we deleted some of the pixels, we've actually got a much smaller file now. The cropped version is around 17 megapixels and the full frame around 45 megapixels. So that may impact how you display or print the final image. So can we simply just crop our images and get good results? I think the key factor is you have to have a good photo to begin with. If you don't have a good photo, you're never going to get good results after cropping. For example, look at this red-capped robin. The bird was just too far away in the middle of the bush. It doesn't matter that I was using the R5 and 700 millimeters, the photo's never going to be any good. However, if you have a look at this eastern curlew that I shot on a 5D4, it's a really nice image. We had great light and the bird looks fantastic. Now this is a really hard to photograph bird, and I really wanted a headshot showing off that amazing bill. So I've done a really big crop showing the headshot. What do you think of the results? How big do you think this final image is in terms of megapixels? Believe it or not, this final image is only about 5 megapixels in size, or around 2,800 pixels wide. Do I care? No, it's gone into my collection. I'm never going to print it huge. I can display it on social media if I wanted to. I'm really happy with this photo. So where we do run into trouble with cropping is when the bird is small, we might have extra noise, or it's just not that sharp. When we crop, it just exacerbates those issues. So if you have a look at this Pacific black duck that I shot, a really poor image with lots of noise. When I crop in, it just doesn't hold up very well. This one's 5 megapixels as well, but I'd never use this image. It just lacks detail and I just don't like the image. Speaking of noise, the bigger the crop, the more visible the noise will be. If any of you have shot with an APS-C camera, you'll know what I'm talking about. Let's take a look at an example. So here are two images, both taken at ISO 12800, which is quite high. One's taken at 1000 millimeters on the R6, and the other's taken at 500 millimeters on the R5. Now the noise is almost identical when we look at them full frame. However, when I crop in heavily on the R5 image, we can see just how visible that noise is. If you don't have a lot of noise to begin with, then often it doesn't really matter. It's only when you have a lot of noise that it gets a lot worse. Another really important factor when it comes to cropping is how many megapixels you have. This R5 gives me 45 megapixels. The R6 that I'm filming on gives me 20 megapixels, so it's quite a difference. The question is, does that impact our image quality? It basically comes down to how much you crop and what you intend to do with that image. That's really important. Let's take a look at this example. Both shots taken at 500mm, one on the R5, one on the R6. If I crop both images to a composition that I like, we can see that the R6 image is now around 2560 pixels wide, or 4.3 megapixels. The R5, on the other hand, gives us about a 10 megapixel image, which is around 3860 pixels wide. So it's obviously a bigger image. Now, if we posted either of these images to any social media platform whatsoever, you couldn't tell the difference. That's because none of these display any images greater than, I think, 1900 pixels wide. So we don't get any advantage to the R5 in this scenario. We could also display both images quite easily on a 1080p monitor or a 1440p monitor. Again, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The only time you can tell the difference is when we go to a 4K monitor, because the R5 image can display natively on that because we've got over 3850 pixels, whereas the R6 image is just too small and you can't display it on a 4K monitor. That's where the bigger megapixels come in. But if you're not displaying it on those big monitors, then it doesn't really matter. So how much you crop your images generally comes down to how close you can get and what your starting focal length is. For me, I used the R6 for almost a year because I had 700mm focal length and I never had to crop it by more than 50%. So it was never really an issue for me. I never felt limited by the megapixels. However, if all I had was a 400mm lens, then I'd find the R6 a little bit problematic and I would definitely benefit from an R5. All right, the second way to crop an image is by using a crop sensor like this 40D. So I think the easiest way for me to explain how these crop sensors work is to think about the image that's coming down the lens. So if I'm photographing, say, this scarlet robin, the scarlet robin comes in circular down the lens and then it hits the sensor on the camera and the sensor records that image. So now let's say I was using a full frame camera with a sensor size of, say, 24 by 36mm. I've overlaid the sensor onto the image and that's what the camera is going to capture. The rest of the image is simply discarded and not used. So for Canon, they use an APS-C sensor, which is actually 1.6 times smaller than the full frame. I think Nikon and Sony, they use a 1.5, and Micro Four Thirds has actually got a sensor that's 2 times as small as a full frame sensor. Let's have a look at how the Canon APS-C sensor looks when we overlay it on this image circle. You can see just how much smaller it is. We're losing a lot of information, but the bird is a lot bigger in our frame. Because these sensors are so small, they're actually capturing a smaller part of the image. A 500mm lens on an APS-C body gives us an effective focal length of around 800mm, or 500 times 1.6. What that means is if I want the bird the same size in the viewfinder on a full frame camera, I would need a lens that was around 800mm focal length. Now the focal length hasn't changed, it's just that the effective focal length, what it looks like in the camera, is different on an APS-C body. So I've overlaid the other crop sensor sizes from other manufacturers. We've got the 1.6 crop, 1.5 crop, and Micro Four Thirds. So it's important to know that APS-C sensors actually have a lot of drawbacks. Probably the biggest one is just the noise. I know when I used my APS-C sensor, I just couldn't really go over ISO 1600, whereas on this full frame body, I can go up to ISO 12800, and that's quite a big difference. They have a larger depth of field, less tonal range, less dynamic range. You know, in poor light, they just tend to struggle. However, in good light, they're very competitive. Let's take a look at how this affordable kit performs out in the field. So I've got my 10 megapixel 40D paired with my 400 5.6, gives us an effective focal length of around 640mm. The other kit I used was the R6 with the 100 to 500. All right, so these are the two shots on the screen. Can you tell which one was taken with the 40D and which was taken with the R6? Believe it or not, the image on the left was actually taken with the 40D. It was shot at ISO 200, which gave us the best possible image quality. So I was pretty surprised with the field of view difference between the two kits. Obviously, the effective focal length of 640 makes the bird just that much bigger, but at this 100%, they look very similar, and it shows you just how competitive a $40 camera is compared to the much more expensive R6. So I was overall pretty surprised with how well it performed, but I need to stress that these were perfect conditions. I had great light, I was nice and close, low ISO. This is about as best as it's going to get. If I shot this in poor conditions, there would be a big difference between the two. So I often get asked if I use the 1.6 crop mode on the R5. Effectively, you can just push a button and it makes it an APS-C sensor about 17 megapixels in size. And you can see on the screen, we've got the full frame image on the right, and we've got the APS-C 1.6 crop version on the left. Both of these images are exactly the same. I could just crop the full frame in post, which would give me the same image. The question is, why would you ever use the crop mode in this camera? Well, I think the main reason would be to get the bird bigger in the viewfinder. I know a lot of people prefer the bird bigger, and perhaps the autofocus, you find it a little bit easier with a bigger bird. You'd also get smaller file sizes because you, in theory, could have a much bigger buffer shooting in that APS-C. And perhaps if the bird was so far away, you knew you didn't need all those surrounding pixels, you could use that. For me personally, I don't use it because I'm just too worried that I'd clip a wing or miss some sort of action, and I'd just kick myself if I knew I was in crop mode and I've missed something. So I just leave it full frame and crop it on the computer. Another way to make the bird bigger in your frame is to use extenders. Say this 2x extender here, if I put this on my 500mm lens, makes it 1000mm. It sounds like a lot of focal length, and it sounds like a no-brainer. However, it's not quite that simple. And I get asked this quite a bit. Should I buy an extender? Well, it all depends on the lens you're attaching to. In my experience, extenders work best on fast primes. So they definitely work on zooms. However, extenders slow down your autofocus, increase your max aperture, and they reduce your image quality. So you have to be aware of this when you put one on. It's just going to be a lot harder to get images using extenders, and you're probably better off just cropping, to be honest. Let's take a look at a comparison that I did. I've got a really old 1DX full frame body. I think it's around 18 megapixels in size. I'm going to attach that to my 500 with a 1.4 extender, giving me 700mm focal length. I'm going to compare that with the R5 on my 400 5.6. So we've got 400mm and 45 megapixels versus 700mm and 18 megapixels. Let's have a look at how they compare. As we can see from the uncropped shots, it's pretty clear that 700mm gives us a beautiful out of focus background. Our depth of field is just narrower, and the bird is much bigger in the frame. The 400mm is quite short, meaning the bird's very small and the background is not as out of focus. So I've now cropped them to the same field of view. The 1DX is still 18 megapixels. The R5 is now around 14 megapixels. All right, so here's the zoomed in versions. Can you tell which is which? I was actually pretty surprised with just how well the R5 and 400 combo competed with that 700mm lens. Sure, the background looks differently, but the details in the bird look almost identical. And overall, there's not that much of a difference between the two. It shows just how much of an advantage that 45 megapixel sensor is. All right, let's try an extreme example. R5 500mm, R6 1000mm. As you can see, the field of view difference is extreme. 1000mm just makes the bird a lot bigger. Let's crop both images to a pleasing composition. To say I was shocked was a bit of an understatement. The R5 image has held up extremely well to the crop. It's now only 6 megapixels in size, but you could still display that on a 1440p monitor if you wanted to. And the R6 image is around 12 megapixels now that I've cropped it, and you'd be able to show this on a 4K monitor. And when we zoom into 100%, it shows just how well the R5 holds up. The noise difference is pretty minimal. Yep, the 1000mm is more detail, but so it should, because it's got 100% more reach. I think this just goes to show how impressive the R5 sensor is. Okay, what if we use the 20 megapixel R6? I've got a shot at 500 and a shot at 1000mm, both taken on the R6. Again, the difference is massive, but this time we do not have the cropping headroom of the 45 megapixel. Let's crop both to a pleasing composition. The 500mm shot is now around a 3.8 megapixel file versus the 18 megapixels of the 1000mm. We're now a little restricted on how we could view this cropped image. It'd be fine on social media, but we couldn't really display it all that well on certain TVs or monitors. And when we view the images at 100%, we can see a clear difference between the two. We can see if you've got a smaller megapixel body, the extenders actually do give you quite an advantage because you just don't have that cropping ability. And that brings me to the final question, and how well does the upscaling software work? If you've got Adobe Lightroom, then you've got Adobe's new enhanced super resolution, where it quadruples the amount of megapixels you have. So our 20 megapixel R6 file is now actually 80 megapixels once we've enhanced it. How does it actually look at 80 megapixels? Let's find out. I've enhanced the 500mm image, and now I've cropped that down to the 1000mm field of view. And as you can see, they're actually very similar now in size. So at this crop, it's pretty hard to tell them apart. Let's zoom into 100% to see if we can see some differences. All right, when we do zoom in, we can see some IQ differences. The super resolution image is a little bit crunchy, it's lacking the fine detail, but we've got to put this into context. We're comparing a 500mm image to a 1000mm image. And the fact that they can even compete, at that normal composition is pretty incredible. And it's going to give you a lot of flexibility if you have a smaller megapixel body. It's going to enable you to print large or display large if you need to. Now, of course, we need to remember that we could upscale the R5, which would give us, what, 180 megapixel image. Slightly ridiculous, and it would be a bit hard to process, but it's an amazing piece of software. All right, one final comparison, and this time is the R6 and the R5, both at 500 millimeters from 10 meters distance. I'm going to upscale the R6 image, I'm going to process them both, and I'm going to show you them and see if you can tell the difference. Which is the R5 and which is the R6. All right, here's image number 1. And here's image number 2. Which is which? All right, here's the two uncropped images. The R6 is actually the left image and the R5 is the right image. So the R6 was upscaled using Adobe Super Resolutions, 80 megapixels, compared to the 45 megapixels of the R5. When we zoom into the R5 to 100% and scale the R6, we can see that they are very similar. So I do believe the R5 is actually a slightly better file, and I'd prefer not to use the upscaling, but it's definitely an option should you need it. All right, it's been a long video. We did lots of testing. So what did we learn? What are our conclusions? Well, if money is no object, then a high megapixel, high focal length is clearly the best option. You're enabled to get the bird big in the frame and have a big file. Check out this image of a red-capped robin that I was able to obtain using 700 millimeters on the R5. It just looks fantastic, and I'm very happy with this image. If you want portability and the need to crop, well, this kit here is the way to go. A nice 100 to 500 zoom with the R5 enables you to take shots out in the field and crop them and still have nice images. Currently looking at getting into mirrorless and you've only got EF gear and perhaps 400 millimeters as your maximum focal length, then I'd highly suggest getting the R5 body. Put that on your 400 millimeters and you'll be able to crop it and still have nice file. So if you want a mirrorless body but you can't afford the R5 and you've already got EF gear, then the R6 is a really good option. If you've got an extender, you can potentially use that, or you could upscale the R6 image if it's not big enough. If you're on a budget, then clearly a nice old APS-C body with, say, a 400mm lens is going to give you an effective focal length of 640, which will enable you to get lots of nice shots. I used that for over 2 years and I was really happy with the shots I was able to obtain. At the end of the day, it all comes down to what your budget is, what your style is, and what you want from photography. Yes, the high megapixel, high focal length will get you the best shots, but that shouldn't be a limiting factor on you getting out and having fun. I started out like everyone else. I've still got my original kit, my 40D 400 5.6. I still take it out from time to time. That's how my passion for bird photography started. Just getting out there week after week, just taking photos and improving my technique. It's also important to remember all these tests that I was doing were of stationary subjects and really nice light, and I was pretty close. It'll be a different story out in the field with moving subjects. There's a lot of other variables at play. However, I just thought it would be a bit of fun to test all the lenses and cameras that I've got and share them with you. I'll share some of the raw files in the description below if you want to download them and have a bit of a play with yourself. So I'd love to hear from you in the comments what you thought of today's video. Was any of it interesting? What's important to you? What have you found in the field? Let's get a conversation going. I do read all the comments. I really do appreciate all that support. If you like this video, obviously give it that thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more of these videos. Thank you again to all my members that support the channel. And until the next video, take care and see you later. We're comparing a 500mm image to an 1000mm image. Now you can see how quickly, you can see how much better their image, you can see how much better the image is. Kookaburra. Kookaburra serenading us.